Good afternoon. Um, I want to thank you all for this invitation. There was this small matter of an election that took place this weekend, and so I guess that's the occasion for me to be here. The political pundits and prognosticators predicted that this would be a very close election, and in that respect, this did not disappoint. And so the top headline here is that Governor John Bell Edwards won a second term in a deep red Republican state. He remains the only Democrat elected governor basically in the Deep South. So certainly that was the national headline coming out of this race. And so I'm going to I'm just going to say a few things, make a few broad comments about perhaps why that happened and probably why that matters, and then we'll take some time for some questions. One of the first things I want to mention is turnout. The turnout in the runoff election on Saturday was 50.7%, according to the unofficial tally from the Louisiana's Office of the Secretary of State. That's about 5 points higher than on the October 12 primary. Specifically, African American turnout was higher during the runoff, and for Democrats, that's important. For John Bell Edwards, during the October 12th primary, about 27% of the electorate was African American. This is probably one of the reasons why they were not able to win the October 12th primary outright. So they were able to get that number up, specifically in Orleans Parish, which was key, East Baton Rouge Parish, and also in Caddo Parish. So that was very, very important. Out of Orleans Parish, of course, John Bell Edwards got over 100,000 vote lead, winning that parish 90% to 10%. Also, there was a big uptick in East Baton Rouge Parish compared to what we saw on October the 12th. So certainly that was one of the elements that had to happen for John Bell Edwards in a closer race for him to win, is to have larger African American turnout. But I think another thing that's interesting about this race as well is how the demographics of the state politically have changed. Not only did John Bell Edwards win in some of the traditional Democratic places, urban cores like Shreveport, Baton Rouge, and New Orleans, but John Bell Edwards also carried Jefferson Parish, and who's been a student of Louisiana politics, for the last 50 years or so. This is a big deal. This is a seismic shift in Louisiana politics. Jefferson Parish, in many ways, is like the cradle for the modern Republican Party in the state of Louisiana. This is the part of the state that produced politicians like Dave Treen, David Vitter, Steve Scalise. And in 1989, a young man won a state house seat out of that parish. I think you've heard of him. I think his name is David Duke. And so for John Bell Edwards got 57% of the vote in Jefferson Parish. And Jefferson Parish had the second highest turnout in absolute numbers in the entire state, other than East Baton Rouge Parish. So that was another factor in John Bel Edwards' victory, was winning in Jefferson Parish. Now, and obviously there have been some demographic shifts in Jefferson Parish, so it looks very differently than it did 20, 30, 40 years ago. But this is significant, and it also has some other implications in terms of state politics. Politics. On the flip side, one of the things that some people mention about John Bel Edwards as to why he had a chance to get elected in Louisiana is because he is unlike many of your national Democrats, he is a pro-life, pro-gun, fairly moderate Democrat who, and for those reasons, has a chance to be competitive in a state like Louisiana. However, interestingly enough, the part of the state where it might seem that kind of appeal might be the most appealing, and that would be Acadiana, Southwest Louisiana, West Louisiana. This is firmly red country. This is Trump territory. And when you're thinking historically about Louisiana politics, this is Huey Long, Edwin Edwards territory. These are some of the places where even in 2003, Kathleen Blanco really is the last Democrat to carry this region of the state. 2003, and so if you count, in some ways, graphically, if you look at the map from say 2003, when Kathleen Blanco defeated Bobby Jindal in a runoff, very similar margin of victory between the two candidates, but now the Democratic candidate and the Republican candidate are really drawing their base from different parts of the state. At least in the governor's race, the GOP was largely a rural party. But they had big problems in urban areas, which is what we expected, but also in the suburbs. And that's something that we probably should talk about going forward. Then, of course, there is the issue of Donald Trump. What was the Trump effect? This is literally and metaphorically the elephant in the room. Of course, obviously, Eddie responding, and unless you were under a rock during his entire campaign, he attached himself to Donald Trump as if that was his umbilical cord. He ran as the Trumpiest of all the candidates. He tried to nationalize the race. He talked about immigration. He talked about sanctuary cities. He accused John Bel Edwards of releasing dangerous criminals onto the Louisiana streets, et cetera, et cetera. The president himself, of course, made 3 trips to Louisiana, 2 during the runoff. In Monroe and also in Bossier City, which is kind of close to my neck of the woods, to try to juice up Republican turnout. It appears that the Trump effect was mixed. There is evidence that Republican turnout did go up in some of those places, but however, it was overwhelmed by the uptick in Edwards' support between the first primary and the second, and then the runoff election. And so perhaps what we're seeing here is a continuation of a pattern that we really have seen really since 2017. is that Donald Trump is a very polarizing candidate, and so he, while he can also he can bring out more rural voters who base voters to support Republican candidates. He also tends to motivate the opposition. And we saw this in 2017 in some races that even though Democrats lost, the Republicans in places like North Dakota had to spend more time than they should have in races in which previously Republican were winning by 25 points. And we saw a lot of this in 2018 in the congressional midterms, where President Trump interjected himself into a number of congressional races, and there seemed to be a backlash against him. Again, particularly in the suburbs. And so this is turns out to be a problem here for Republicans, and it tends to portend potentially a problem for the Republicans in 2020. So there are some national implications as well as implications just for this particular race in our state going into 2020. Again, this is basically the second time in a couple of weeks in which Donald Trump has interjected himself into a governor's race. We saw what happened in Kentucky, where actually Mark Bevin was actually ahead. He was ahead by 5 points prior to Trump's visit. He ended up losing that state by 0.5% of the vote. So actually, Donald Trump has cost Mark Bevin 5.5 percentage points in one day. And then he interjected himself into this particular race. He personalized it. He said he needed the victory, and surprisingly, on yesterday, he tweeted about 40 different times, but somehow strangely didn't mention the governor's race in Louisiana. And maybe it just slipped his mind. So that's my general spill on the governor's race. On an important note to end on, and though obviously the governor's race was the headline, it was the major race in the state. Obviously, Republicans obviously still control every other statewide office. So John Bel remains the only Democrat elected statewide in the state of Louisiana. And the Republicans have a supermajority in the House and the Senate. And so it's going to be very interesting going forward. John Bel will probably face the most conservative legislature in 100 years. And help. See. Mm-hmm. Didn't. Okay.
God, Harrison, what is going on here?
It's my mic. Let me figure it out. You figure it.
I'll figure it. It's my mic.
Okay. You got it?
You're good.
That wasn't taught to us in graduate school. Okay, I am. That will conclude my overview, and at this time, I'll be willing to entertain your questions. Yes.
Dr. Stevens, a lot has been made about Rusconi bringing in like an out-of-state campaign team. Do you think that his non-Louisiana team, did that affect how his campaign
Yes, yeah, yes. I think the question here was about whether or not the fact that responding brought in an out-of-state campaign team, whether or not that affected the race, would there have been a different result had they relied more locally? I think there's probably something to that, but I think that in general, the um, the Responding campaign, from the very beginning, tried to nationalize this race. And they did it in terms of messaging. They also did it in terms of relying on outside individuals to help run this campaign. And and at the end of the day, at the end of the day, it appears that that did not work. Now, what John Bell Edwards did was to try to make this campaign about the state of Louisiana, make it about his record and what he has done the last 4 years, so try to localize it. So obviously we had two very different strategies at work, and it appears that Edwards' strategy was the better strategy. Got a hand right here, and then Mark Bell. Okay, we'll go with Mark Bell.
Oh, my turn? Sweet. The African American community really kind of was responsible for John Bell Edwards winning because of that turnout. Are there certain issues that now would be expected that Edwards would follow and take care of? Are there certain issues that the community would like him to do? And what are they?
Well, that's actually a very interesting question here. I think that is, I think well right here the question here was about the central role that the African American community played. Their higher turnout was a big factor in Edwards' victory, and so are there some issues that the African American community would expect that Edwards would now be on the hook for now that they've been successful, and I think that is interesting. I think that's a very interesting question here that you raised. I think to some degree, a lot of the mobilization was built on, quite frankly, fear of what a responding governorship would mean, specifically about Medicare and Medicare expansion. I think that was a really big issue in this race because Responding was proposing to freeze Medicare expansion, and so a lot of people saw that as a threat. As a threat, so I would expect some African Americans who hope that progress will continue. I expect that they would probably look at things like education and see if they can get more funding toward education. But I also think a lot of this was actually driven by fear, and this is a threat that things like that would be undermined in a responding administration. Okay, I think your hand was up, and I got a hand here, and then we'll figure that out.
From the first day the governor took office during his inauguration speech, even till 2 nights ago at the acceptance speech at the victory party, he brought up two very familiar things. The first one was equal pay for women, the other one being a minimum wage hike. Now with an overwhelmingly conservative House and Senate now, what chances, if any, do you see anything even getting out of committee on that?
Given the fact that the legislature now, I think, is probably going to be even more conservative than it was when he first took office, I honestly don't see those issues being very successful. Now, certainly he ran on those. Those issues are very popular with the Democratic base, at the base, and from his standpoint, those are the right positions to take. I just don't see the votes in the legislature. I'm sure you're going to introduce it, and but I don't see it going anywhere. I think you were next, right? Yes.
As a sociologist, I'd like to ask about brands and how you think that might have affected the vote in East Baton Rouge Parish, which was over by 51,000 votes. Is it possible that the average person in Louisiana who has a high school degree, 75%, which means the average income is about 40,000, that while they're paying mortgage payments, car payments, getting the kids to school and getting them back and worrying about the family, as this goes along, as the campaign goes along, do they eventually stop and look and say, one guy has tied himself to Trump and the other one is not, and what did this guy with Trump do? When they find out that he's local, was he a councilman, was he a Boy Scout leader, and did they then come out and vote because they knew this man well?
What's the question?
So I'm asking about a brand timing, so initially he got a vote for being tied to Trump, and as the public got to know him, do you think that's a timing issue in terms of branding as a sociologist?
Right. Okay, I guess again, the question here is about branding, and to what effect that had. Obviously, I think that to some degree, branding does work. What we're seeing, not just in Louisiana in this race, but all over the country, is that we are becoming more and more polarized. And I think that some of the vote that Rispone got was simply because he tied himself to Donald Trump. And I'm on the red team, and so we've seen we've kind of seen this play out. However, what he found out is that wasn't enough, and that only can get you so far. And ultimately, candidates do matter. They matter. And to be honest with you, Eddie Rispone was a bad candidate. It's just simple. I mean, now I understand what I mean when I say he's a bad candidate. You don't have to be a good candidate to win an election. Okay. You just need to have enough people who think that the other person is worse. For example, there were. I mean, in terms of Donald Trump was a bad candidate. I'm not talking about in terms of whether or not you for him or against him. And I mean, he has zero message discipline. I mean, in terms of things that we think about candidates, he has zero message discipline. He doesn't listen to his advisors. He goes off on tangents, et cetera, et cetera. He takes conflicting positions, and you don't know what he believes. So in terms of a lot of the political sciencey textbook things, he's a bad candidate. Bad candidate. In fact, and even some of the people who voted for him admit they don't like him. But they hated Hillary Clinton. So you don't have to be a good candidate to win a race. I mean, it's just simply sufficient if the other person is worse in your mind, and you feel like that the world will come to an end if that person is in office. So again. But however, in this particular contest, I think candidate quality actually does matter. Does matter. And Eddie Rispone is not just he just once you got beyond the slogans, I mean, he really didn't have very much to say. He didn't go to the traditional. I think I may have said it this time. Traditional retail politics in Louisiana. He didn't go to the pecan festival or the Strawberry Festival, or the Crawfish Festival, or whatever excuse for a festival that we need in Louisiana, because we really don't really need a bunch of excuse for it. He didn't do a lot of that retail politics. He seemed to be very comfortable having these closed door meetings with Republican donors. In fact, he was caught on tape saying that I don't think that's necessary for me to do. That hurt him. There were a lot of the forums that he just simply didn't attend. Like, say, when the Baton Rouge Area Chamber, typically a business-friendly audience. This ought to be the kind of constituency that he should be comfortable presenting his ideas. And so John Bel Edwards was able to use that against him. See, he's not asking for your vote. So I think branding does work. For some people, if they can label you as this, that is the end of the discussion. Unfortunately for responding, that wasn't enough to get him over the hump. Okay, I got Louis Rainey. Oh, no, I'm sorry, that was you, and then Louis Rainey, and there's a couple. There you go.
Okay, so elections are done. Now it's time to govern, as they say. The governor now has 4 years to do his job. Legislators have 4 years to do their jobs. What's the incentive, though, to work together here in that time? Now that the elections are done and Republicans have their corner now established and the governor has his.
Well, I guess the question here now is that now that the election is over, this should be the time for governing. And so, what is the incentive now to govern? Well, at least we would like to believe, we would like to believe at this time that this would be an opportunity for the parties to work together. Some parties will work together, that people want to at least have some accomplishments that they can run on in 2023. We would like to believe that that's going to be the case. However, it is highly probable, given what happened in the first 4 years of John Bel Edwards' term, that we will have a renewed partisan bickering. And it's very possible that Republicans who now have even more seats in the legislature may feel even more emboldened to challenge Governor Edwards. It is also very possible that, with the knowledge that John Bel Edwards cannot run for re-election in 2023, that one of the things that we may see in the next 4 years is Republicans, in particular, positioning themselves to be the candidate to challenge for that office. So while many of us are hopeful that at least the first couple of years that perhaps we might actually work on something like, say, tax reform, which a lot of people know we need to do in this state. There have been the legislature had a commission, and they made a whole bunch of recommendations, and then it just sat there and collected dust. So there are needs out there. We're still 48th, 49th in education and a lot of other things. So there's no shortage of things to do. I'm just not so sure they're going to do though. And I think, who was that? Louis Rainey, and then.
My question is this. There's an organizational session in January. Do you think there's any chance this time that the governor might get his wishes with regard to legislative leadership so that we can get some things done?
No. Yes.
This is probably historically the most expensive political process we've ever seen. What's your thoughts on the concerns of the influence of money in future elections?
Repeat that question, please.
The question was raised about the expensiveness of this race and whether or not what are our concerns going forward in terms of the influence of money in politics. There's no reason to believe that things in terms of if you believe that money in politics, and specifically, I would say more to the point, the influence of outside groups in Louisiana in the race, because really, probably in terms of just proportion per capita, we've actually had some very expensive races in Louisiana. 1970s, 1980s, when we had when oil was king, and back in those good old days, I mean, Louisiana was actually known for having some of the most expensive races in the country. I mean, we had a $20 million governor's race in 1979, which probably if you index that to inflation, would be a lot higher than what was spent in this race. What is significant now is, in the world of Citizens United and super PACs, is that it's so much easier to bring outside money into a lot of these campaigns, and the use of dark money, and that doesn't appear like that's going away anytime soon. I mean, I think the Supreme Court has opened the doors for all that. I think, and regardless of what happens in the 2020 presidential race, unless the Democrats can somehow get a supermajority in the Senate, which is, I mean, they'll be lucky to get a majority in the Senate. I don't see that changing anytime soon. So I think you had a question. There's a question in the back. Question?
The governor used a lot of his ad spots to link responding to Bobby Jindal, and apparently that drew a lot of white Republicans maybe toward the governor. Has Jindal become that much of a liability to Republicans?
Bobby Jindal was many ways on the ballot. If you didn't know any better, you would think that John Bel Edwards was running against Bobby Jindal again. But in many ways, Eddie Rispone was one of Bobby Jindal's funders. A big time donor. He supported a lot of his agenda, particularly when it comes to charter schools in particular. So yes, the link was was that Bobby Jindal in October of 2015 had an approval rating of 20%. I think perhaps Chris Christie might have been the only governor at the time who was even more unpopular, because of Bridgegate, that scandal. I mean, so yeah, I think that. So yeah, and there were Republicans, people who were Republicans who otherwise voted Republican down the ticket, who said, well, you know what? I remember what Bobby Jindal did to state. If you were a supporter of LSU and you're of the parents who were affected by TOPS, and you saw what happened to higher education, a lot of those Republicans voted for John Bel Edwards. And so, yes.
Take Matt Lanning first.
Okay. All right. Matt Lanning.
There, obviously, whatever worked at the top of the ballot for the governor didn't work down the ballot.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to know how you rectify the disparity between a governor getting elected and the legislature becoming perhaps the most conservative it's ever been. What's happening in our state from a broader perspective?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. Yes, at the top, the question was at the top, yes, the governor won, but the Republicans won everything else. And I think that part of this is Louisiana's politics has really changed since Katrina. I think in many ways the state was trending more conservative prior to Katrina, but Katrina really exacerbated those trends. But Louisiana has also been traditionally a governor-centered state, which kind of gets to the question you raised earlier about how governors, for example, have been used to dictating the leadership of legislature, and for probably the first time in 2016, the Republicans said, no, we're not having it. We're going to decide who is the House Speaker and the Senate President. So that was a big change. But in Louisiana, the Democratic Party in Louisiana simply has not adjusted. The Democratic Party has dominated state politics in Louisiana really since the 1830s, since there was a Democratic Party. In fact, the Democrats could win. It didn't require the Democratic Party to be organized in Louisiana. They just won. I'm not a member of the organized party, I'm a Democrat. That was Louisiana. It was the Republican Party that had to be organized, if for no other reason, just to decide who was going to lose next. Okay, and it's not a volunteer reason. But what happened is, when term limits was being prepared, Republicans were preparing for that. David Vitter, had his PAC. And they were preparing for the fact that a lot of Democrats were going to be term limited, and a lot of those seats would be open seats. And so, the Republicans had a plan, and we see the Republicans continue to execute that plan. And so, a lot of times, what's happening is Democrats are not just losing seats. In some cases, there's not even a candidate. Okay, the Republicans had a plan. But the Democrats have depended upon the governor having the power. Well, that was the way things used to work in the legislature. It wasn't so much Democrat versus Republican as so much as either you're for the governor or you're against the governor. But that is not the political landscape of today, and the Democratic Party has yet to adjust to that change.
To follow up on Matt's question, with the eclipse of white Democrats in the legislature. Does the party have any bench at all? There's the occasional relic, like my old friend Francis Thompson from the old days.
Mm-hmm.
But after that, is John Bell Edwards the last Democrat in the foreseeable future?
That's a profound question. Now, again, what is going forward in this, and then especially when you consider that the census is about to come up, and so reapportionment will be happening, and so we would expect that the Republicans will try to pad their advantage and bake that in for the next 10 years. However, what Democrats should look at if they plan to be competitive is that, keep in mind, in this race, 50.7% of the registered voters voted, which means about 49% of Louisiana is still not voting. And so the point is that there are possibilities to bring into the political process a lot of people who are on the sidelines. But of course, you've got to give people a reason, to vote. And so yes, the Democratic Party, I wouldn't write them off yet, but they're going to have to start thinking differently. Because what they're doing right now isn't working. They're going to have to figure out a way to bring back into the political process a significant portion of that 49% who chose not to vote on Saturday, because otherwise the math doesn't work. Why the math doesn't work? I think you had a question. Then we got a question, and get Beth Courtney.
Okay.
Go to Beth.
Have you seen any data on female and male voters? I'd like to. Have you seen the breakout?
I haven't looked at it specifically for Saturday, but I don't want to.
I'd like you to look at Jefferson Parish.
Okay.
Because it's interesting. You talked about how significant that was, but I'd like you to look at that female-male vote there, because I think there. And then also the comment is there were a lot of female candidates who were running who did not win. So we once again will have a small percentage, be they Republicans or Democrats in the legislature, female. So, any comments on that?
Well, again, I haven't looked into those numbers Jefferson Parish broke it out on those lines, but that's one thing. You just give me another homework assignment here. I didn't look at, one thing that we would expect, given some of the national trends that are happening, is that one of the warning spots for Republicans is suburban women being a problem, and particular, and so it'd be interesting to look at the numbers in Jefferson Parish and see if.
National stories too, but then you have to say, why is that a problem? And is that a problem for the president?
Well, it is a problem for the president.
Why?
It is a big problem for the president. If you see the polls, I know the polls have gotten polls themselves have been attacked in the last few years. However, I mean, I think that the Republicans have been hemorrhaging with women, particularly and we saw that in the midterms, in congressional midterms, and we saw that a couple of weeks ago in Kentucky, where Mark Bevin was defeated, and he got defeated in places like the Cincinnati suburbs that have a lot of suburban voters and a lot of suburban women. This is a problem for the Republican Party, and we saw a continuation of that narrative on Saturday here in Louisiana. And so this is a problem. This is a problem going forward, because even though Louisiana may not, I think it would be presumptuous to call Louisiana a swing state in 2020 race. However, Louisiana has some demographic profiles that are in some ways that are similar to some of the battleground states that the president was looking at in 2020. And the math is daunting for Donald Trump. And this also should be a warning sign for Republicans. See, one of the things that Trump, I think one of the reasons why Trump got involved in this race, and also in Kentucky race, is that it's in part because of the national narrative about impeachment. His strategy has always been a base strategy. Let me hold on to my base. In part, to say to congressional Republicans, see, you have to hang with me if you'd like to survive, regardless of what else is happening. And so the result in Kentucky and the result in Louisiana undermine that argument. And I think there should be alarm bells going off in the White House and also among House Republicans, but also Senate Republicans, who will potentially be his jury in this impeachment inquiry, which I think is almost an absolute certainty that he will be impeached. I think who's next? Okay.
When a person votes, how much information is available about that person? Party affiliation, male, female, ethnic background. Where's all that information coming from, and what's available to you who are gathering that information? What's the question?
I think the question here is that when a person votes, where does the information come from? I think the information comes from all over, and I think that's part of the problem. I think that's part of the problem, especially I think the voters in many ways are bombarded with multiple places today, with campaign, with campaign ads on television, now with the use of social media.
Let me re-ask the question. When a person votes, is his information male, female, Democrat, Republican, ethnic background, is all of it available to?
It's on the voter process.
Is it available in the voter file? Do I have a file with my vote record? What's in it?
Every time you voted.
You voted. Yeah, it's available. Information it's available. Now what people do with it is another question. It's available. It's a, we got a hand over here.
Dr. Samuels, in his concession speech, Eddie was talking about, I mean, I'm not going away, you know, he was real gracious. With his history of support, education in tax reform and other Republicans that ran for years, what do you think his influence is now? He still might have the money, or will his influence die because he lost, or like you say, he's a bad candidate, or will he increase his opinions or whatever? Will they become more worthy to a candidate? They got Senate races coming up pretty soon. There's a lot of things that will be coming up. You think Eddie is gonna drop off or what?
Well, if we take him at his word that he's still going to be around, he couldn't obviously be a factor. Given the fact that last I checked, he still has a lot of money, and that's something that candidates are always looking for or in the need for. And so certainly he will be well positioned to really play whatever role he wants to play. He came up short, but he got 49% of the vote, which, considering that, and you got to say, for a person who has never run for office before, on your first time running, to get 49% of the vote, that is significant, and so some people are going to listen to you because of that. So some of it is going to depend on what role he wants to play. But yeah, he's.
I don't think you could ever see him run again because he's 70 years old. I'm sure he's gonna have interest, especially on education. That's his stuff.
Well, obviously, he's had those issues before, because he's been a big supporter of school choice and that kind of charter school movement. And of course, that's also, by the way, one of the results of this election is that the slate sponsored by the Louisiana Association of Business Industry basically won a clean sweep in the best of the elections. And so, so if you think that the charter school movement was a bad thing for Louisiana, well, you lost. Those who were opposing that viewpoint got routed.